Hi, I'm Becky Parker Geist. I am the host of the Audiobook Connection podcast, Behind the Scenes with the Creative Teams. I'm also president of Bay Area Independent Publishers Association and the CEO of Pro Audio Voices. And I am excited to have with me today Bev Scott. Bev is the author of the memoir Sarah's Secret, a Western tale of betrayal and forgiveness. Bev, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So let's jump in. You described the writing of this book like finding a skeleton in a musty old trunk. I love that image. But tell us,
Yes.
if you would, about the moment, if you can recall it, but the moment that you kind of became aware that there was a musty old trunk to be opened.
Um, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I became aware at a family reunion, um, and where a rumor went around that our grandfather had had another family.
Oh. Hmm.
And it was a surprise. Everybody acknowledged that my grandmother had never told anyone. And so I was encouraged by my aunt um, to see what I could find out at the National Archives. Um, and that's what I did. And this was before the archives had all the information online.
Mm.
So we traveled to Washington, D.C., and went to the National Archives. And part of the reason for going was my grandfather was a veteran of the Civil War. And most people in my generation don't have a grandfather that fought in the Civil War.
Mm.
Um, he was born in 1840. Um, and so they have files of all veterans, and they brought out these two very thick files, each about 2 inches thick, of documents and letters and correspondence and so forth. And in that large pile of paper, I discovered that it was indeed true that he had another family. And I sort of began tracking from the time he was born and how all of this developed.
Yeah. Well, so I'm really intrigued by what that family reunion must have been like. The picture that is conjured up in my mind is these whisperings behind closed doors. And what do you know where the rumor started? What triggered that conversation at that point?
Yes. Um, Two of my father's brothers um, lost their wives at about the same time, and they decided to travel to New Mexico, where my grandfather died, and find his gravesite, um, which they did. And the gravestone was in bad shape, let's put it that way. So, recognizing that he was a veteran, they wrote to see if they could get a stone, which was the traditional stone put on a veteran's um, grave.
Hmm.
And the message they got back was, "We're sorry, but this is the wrong name."
Oh,
Um, so
the wrong name of the people who were contacting him?
no,
Contacting the government?
his name,
Oh,
his
his
name,
name, the grandfather's name was wrong.
right? Um, so that led essentially to that was a part of what I was tasked to do, was to find out, okay, what is this about?
Right.
And in at the family reunion, it wasn't that there was a lot of time spent on this, because there were lots of other fun things to do. Um,
Well, that's good.
but but my aunt, who was at that point by then the matriarch of the family, was very interested in finding out what this was all about, which is why she wanted me to go to the archives. And it was indeed true that my grandfather changed his first two names. And he was born John Howard Scott, and he changed his first two names to Harvey Depew Scott.
Oh.
And so that evidence was in the archives, primarily because at some point when he was married to my grandmother, he became quite ill and wanted to get his veterans benefits. And he filed under his current name. And they essentially told him they spent quite a lot of energy and human power to figure out. They sent people to different locations to take depositions all over the country.
Wow.
And one of the people that they interviewed, because he was asked to give them a list of the people that were the men who were in his regiment, one of whom was his former brother-in-law. When they went to interview the brother-in-law, take a deposition, he said, looking at a picture of my grandfather, he said, "Yeah, that looks like the man who was married to my sister, and she lives in Fort Worth."
Oh.
So they went to Fort Worth and interviewed her and her older two children. And so she tells the story then in 1878. He took a load of corn into town and never returned, and left her with 5 children and a 6th on the way.
Oh, my goodness.
And he disappeared. This was 1878. He had been in the census, in the earlier census, 1850, 1860, 1870, but he was not in the 1880 census. And she was listed as a widow. So ultimately, I found him in a veterans census in 1890 because the 1890 US Census was burned up. So he was in a veterans census in 1890, and he homesteaded in 1890, and I got his homestead records, which I had requested.
Right.
So, and of course, I knew that he didn't just disappear because he ended up marrying my grandmother.
Right.
In 1892. Now, she was 22 and he was 52.
Wow.
And she was a school teacher. So there was a period of time of about 12 years where I could find no record of him. And as I did a lot of looking, and I traveled to different parts. We went to Texas, we went to Oklahoma, where my father was born. We went back to Nebraska, where my grandmother's family lived. We did all this. Couldn't find a record of him during this 12 years. So I was originally going to write the story from a genealogy point of view. But I didn't have the information around what happened to him.
Right.
So I decided to write it as fiction, using the facts that I knew, and creating what he was doing in those 12 years. Yeah. And part of what helped was doing a lot of historical research. For example, about the name, I found out that a lot of cowboys change their names, their first two names or their first name,
Oh.
especially if they were on the run.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
This was also the time that cattle were being driven from Texas up to Kansas and put on trains and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I imagined that he might have joined a cattle drive.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been a cook in some prior jobs. And so that maybe he was a cook on the cattle drive and that he was therefore among cowboys and he probably changed his name.
Mm-hmm.
So
Wow.
then the challenge for me was to write a story where he wasn't a total uh, lost, terrible person,
Right.
or my grandmother wouldn't have married him.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
she was a wonderful human being, and
Yeah.
I knew her, when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So I had to figure out a way to write the story so that he wasn't a terrible person.
Mm.
And that was
That's
that was an interesting challenge.
yeah. Yeah. Did you know him at all growing up?
No, no, he died when my father was 4.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of a situation, a life situation of my own. I'll just say briefly, not to
sure.
redirect our conversation, but where taking a taking the facts of something that happened and then writing it in a way to where I had to like put myself in the shoes of other members, in this case of my family, where there had been a rift at the time, and I found it very healing in a way. How was that for you in terms of you trying to write that story? Now, in this case, you didn't know your grandfather, but what was that like for you?
Well, I had to imagine that he was someone that my grandmother could love and respect. They had 5 children, um, and that he was not a loser, so to speak, and that he was somebody that she um, felt comfortable marrying. And so I tried to imagine what what he might have been like
Yeah.
and what might have driven him to abandon his first family.
Hmm.
And I tried several different scenarios. And I was part of a writers group, and it was the feedback from the other members were helpful in
Hmm.
trying to figure out how to describe that possibility.
Yeah.
So I was definitely partial to my grandmother. At the same time, as I got into it, I could kind of identify with him and the challenge that I set up for him in the story. I
Hmm.
don't know if it was a real challenge or not,
Hmm.
but the
Yeah.
fictional challenge I set up for him. And um, so that, um, and I guess another way for me to answer that is that I felt in a lot of respects I was channeling my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she lived with us when I was small, and I was very fond of her. It was very easy for me to get into her life and what
Yeah.
that might have been like for her.
Yeah.
Was much more challenging. But at the same time, I had a good time doing it. I
Oh,
really enjoyed creating the section of the book that is really focused on him.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are all the characters in the book based on your family, or are there
Yes.
others? Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of characters that had to be a part, especially of his section of the book,
Hmm.
that were not part of the family.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. Yeah.
but the rest of the, and I've had people who've read the book saying, okay, which one was your father?
That's great. Great.
Yeah. So,
Um, and yeah, so let's take just a short pause and then we're going to come right back and talk a little bit more about your background and the audiobook.
okay.
Follow the paths of Sarah and Will, or Sam, as they tell their stories of trust, secrets, and betrayal on the frontier in the Old West. Their pioneer spirit helped to fuel the expansion into the Western territories of the United States. The two are historically on their separate journeys, yet they remain intimately connected. Through the fictionalized Western frontier tale of Sam and Sarah, the author, Beverly Scott, was inspired to reveal rumored secrets from her family history. In 1878, Will is on the run after killing a man in a barroom gunfight. He escapes the Texas Rangers by joining a cattle drive as a cook headed to Dodge City. He struggles with the dilemma of saving his life or attempting to return to his pregnant wife and 5 children. Just when he thinks he might be able to return home, he is confronted by a bounty hunter who captures him and plans to return him to Fort Worth, Texas, to be hanged. Get your copy of Sarah's Secret, a Western tale of betrayal and forgiveness on Amplify Audiobooks, the equitable audiobook platform. So you have, I know that you have been a leadership coach and an organizational consultant for many years. Do you see a relationship between the work that you were doing there and the writing of your book at all?
Well, I did write 3 other books that were professional books that were related. And I went into this project thinking, I don't know anything about writing fiction. I felt I was a pretty good writer of nonfiction, and I'd written articles and, these books. So what I did, though, which was sort of characteristic of me, was that I found workshops and books that were sort of helpful in learning what I needed to know about writing fiction. And so, you go to a workshop and you write something and then you get feedback and, So in that sense, I've always been someone who does the research and prepares and does my homework and gets that. So in that sense, there was a tie-in. I think other than that, probably the biggest tie-in probably was learning or creating the dialogue that I realized, especially as I was listening to the audiobook, I was creating the dialogue that was not too dissimilar than what I heard from my parents. So my grandmother is, dealing as a single parent and communicating with her children and so forth in the book. And I realized that that's dialogue that I heard when I was growing up. So there is some, that goes back, of course, to my childhood. But I think other than that, I don't know that it was a direct relationship.
Yeah, I see that. And then I'm just curious also, so I know you also founded the Third Act to support positive aging. And in terms of that work, do you find any connection between that effort and the writing of this memoir?
Oh, yeah, because I was writing the book in my third act. It was my third act project, really. And it was not something I even thought about earlier in my life. I mean, I was interested in genealogy and I was looking forward to having more time to do that, but I never thought about that I would end up writing a historical novel. So it was the project of my own third act, and I think it was a good project. It gave me focus and purpose and enjoyment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was it. I What comes to mind for me is my father wrote a few books in his third act, and
Uh-huh.
and shortly, right before he passed away, he was still figuring out what his next book was going to be,
Yes.
which brought a lot of joy to me. So, and
Yes. Yeah.
because it brought a lot of joy to him, clearly
Right.
you could see the
Yes.
light, the light in his eyes as he thought
Uh-huh.
about what that would be. So
Yeah.
now, you narrated your own audiobook.
Mhm.
And I would love for you to share with our listeners what that experience has been like for you, because there are many authors who are considering narrating their own, aren't certain, some are clear, but for those on the fence, it can be especially helpful to hear what the experience has been of those who have done it.
Well, I really enjoyed it a lot. Um, Two or three things, I think. I loved getting back into the story.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I had flashbacks of writing. And sometimes I'd be at a point and I would remember the challenge of, okay, where do I take this now? So, I had those kind of flashbacks.
Yeah.
Um, I also really enjoyed the process because it reminded me about my grandmother again.
Hmm.
Um, and and when I was writing the book, I really felt like I was in tune with her. And sometimes when I'd get stuck, I would think, well, now what would she be doing in this situation?
Hmm.
So I really enjoyed and doing the reading of the book really brought home to me a lot of that memory of my grandmother.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was really I had a number of colleagues and friends and so forth that encouraged me to do it myself.
Hmm.
Um, and I was really glad that I made that decision to do it. And because it's based on a family story, it seems like it's not a nonfiction book that is where you're all in your head.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, it brought a lot of the emotion and joys and sorrows back as I was reading it. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah. It sounds like from what you said earlier about reading the dialogue, in the process, that was also calling back memories of hearing those
Yes,
words. Yeah.
right. Yes. And I thought a lot in particular about my father, since he's one of the characters.
Hmm.
He's one of the five children. And in the book, he's 4, 5, and 6 years old. And of course, I didn't know him when he was that age.
Hmm.
But I really felt like I was creating this child character that was my dad. Uh,
Hmm.
so it was fun. I
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. What would you say, if there's something that kind of stands out about the process, the audiobook process that you've experienced so far? Anything that sort of jumps out at you, or was maybe the most surprising thing? Um, that can be sometimes an interesting thing to explore.
Well, I was surprised at the ease in which we recorded it, and certainly the audio engineers were really helpful, and it moved along fairly quickly. And a number of people have said to me, oh, that's going to take a really long time. I didn't experience it as taking a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked forward to going in and doing the reading. So it was a pleasure, and not necessarily a pleasure that I had thought much about in advance.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think of it. I didn't dread it, but I just didn't think about it as being a pleasure.
Yeah.
Um, and it's sort of like I was saying, I wrote this story. I like it. It's about my family, and I'd like to tell it to you,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Nice. And what would you love for readers to or listeners to take away from the experience of listening to your audiobook?
Mm. Well, it came out of my genealogy research, and a lot of people have said to me, this goes back um, just to the publication of the book, but that what I discovered was lots of people have family secrets.
Yeah.
And so one thing I would encourage people to do is to take some time and learn more about those secrets in their families.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran into a lot of people who know nothing about their family history. Um, and I just found it very enlightening, really, to do the genealogy and to imagine what my family's history really was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and really a pleasure to do that. So I would encourage people, one, to explore your own family secrets, and two, to do the research and the genealogy to find out more about your family. I think it's told me a lot more about who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
One of the things I would love to highlight about what you've said is about the effort that you put into um, that that creation of the character of your grandfather, and not just making him, the villain, or but
right,
really seeing, trying to see through your grandmother's eyes, in a sense, of what she saw
right,
in him and the man that he was in her eyes. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because those I think it's often the harder thing to do. It's easier in some ways for us to just, black and white an issue, or a
right.
person, right? Oh, they're just whatever,
That's
and dismiss, when actually each one of us has so much more depth and to who we really are. So taking
right.
that time, I think it's a beautiful illustration of your work in in bringing this version of your grandfather to life in a gracious way.
Yeah. Well, it was important to me, and I think prior to writing this story, I I kind of wrote him off. I mean, it's sort of like I didn't like the fact that I had a bigamist as a grandfather,
Right.
because he never got divorced. And so,
Mhm.
he was a bigamist,
Right.
and that he did that, and that his actions were so painful to my grandmother.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things I found in the archives was notes from federal agents that went to tell her that she was not going to get widow's benefits, and the sort of description of her reaction,
Mm.
and that her reaction was so, she sobbed, and she was so upset, that the agent writes, based on her reaction, it's really clear she did not know that
Yeah.
he had another family. And so I was inclined, before I wrote this, to just sort of say, well, he was he was a terrible villain. He did this to her.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
But once I got into it, I really had a much softer, gentler view of him.
Mm-hmm. So you had your
Um,
own journey in your relationship with him
yes,
through the
yeah,
writing of this. Yeah, that's beautiful.
yes. And that's my view of him now. I have a much more balanced view that,
Yeah.
you know, um, his life, he had his challenges and probably made some mistakes, but at the same time, um, he was a person that had his strengths and kindness and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
was a good process for that.
That's good. I think there's a lesson to be learned in there
Yes.
for all of
Maybe
us.
not the same for everybody, but
No,
yes,
maybe we
lesson.
need to be writing compassionate stories about people that we're upset with.
Well, there is some truth in that if we can put ourselves in some other person's shoes and we have a
Yes.
better understanding of what they faced. And I think that's what I did
Yeah.
is
And I think
say,
that is one of the great central gifts that of books and writing and also of the audiobook process of being able to bring that to life. So,
yes,
yeah,
I think I agree with you about that. It
yeah,
is a great gift to do that.
yeah.
Yes.
So, how can our listeners learn more about you and your writing? What's your website?
Oh, you would ask me that. I have a new website.
Great.
um, it's Bev Scott Author is what the website is.
.com.
Yeah. Yeah.
bevscottauthor.com.
Uh-huh.
Great.
Yes.
All right. And at the
And
time that this podcast is released, your audiobook will be available on Amplify Audiobooks, which is where we encourage our listeners to
mhm.
get it. You can support the author.
Yes, and we will put all that on the website too.
Great.
That's how they can access it. Yeah.
Great. Bev, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for this time.
Well, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Yeah, I look forward to getting the audiobook completed and getting it out there.
Great.
So,
Thanks
okay. Thanks,
everyone for
Becky.
joining us. All right.